Captain Dong Ho stared at the coffee maker with the same expression he might use for a broken navigation system. The machine had been making strange gurgling sounds for 3 days now, and the coffee tasted like recycled engine coolant. He pressed the button anyway and watched brown liquid drip into his cup. "Captain, we have a problem," called Bo Ram from the engine room through the ship's communication system. Her voice carried that special tone that meant something expensive had just broken. Dong Ho took a sip of his terrible coffee and winced. "What kind of problem? The kind where we drift in space for a week, or the kind where we explode?" "The kind where our navigation computer thinks we're in 3 different places at once," Bo Ram replied. "The FTL drive is acting like a confused tourist." The Soul Navigator was not an impressive ship. It looked like someone had taken a cargo container and stuck engines on it. The Korean Space Research Institute had built it on a budget that would make a street vendor laugh. But it was their ship, and it had gotten them through 2 years of mapping empty space without killing anyone. Dong Ho walked to the bridge where his crew of 5 was trying to look busy. Tai Min sat at his science station, poking at alien bacteria, samples with the enthusiasm of a child with a new toy. Yeonsu studied tactical displays that showed nothing but empty space. Soo Jin listened to radio signals from distant stars, hoping to find something more interesting than cosmic background noise. "What's our location?" Dong Ho asked, settling into his captain's chair. The chair made a soft wheeze, like an old man, sitting down. Woo Jin, their navigator, looked up from his console with confusion written across his face. "Well, sir, according to the computer, we're either near Earth, in the middle of a star, or somewhere that doesn't exist yet." "I vote for the place that doesn't exist yet," said Taemin without looking up from his microscope. "It sounds more interesting than the other options." Bo-Ram's voice crackled through the speakers again. "Captain, I think I know what happened. Remember that experiment we were supposed to run? The one where we test the new FTL calculations?" Dong Ho remembered. The Korean Space Research Institute had given them a set of modified navigation equations to test. Something about improving jump accuracy by 12%. It had seemed boring enough to be safe. "Please tell me you didn't accidentally activate experimental technology while I was fighting with the coffee machine," Dong Ho said. "I accidentally activated experimental technology while you were fighting with the coffee machine," Bo Ram said. The ship suddenly shook, not violently, but like a bus going over a speed bump. Everyone grabbed their stations. Hei Jin, their medical officer, poked her head out of the medical bay. "Was that supposed to happen?" she asked. "Nothing on this ship is supposed to happen," Dong Ho replied. "Woo Jin, what do the sensors show?" Woo Jin's fingers danced across his console. His face went from confused to very confused. "Sir, I'm reading multiple large ships nearby, really large ships, and they're all pointing weapons at us." Through the main view screen, space twisted and revealed something that definitely hadn't been there before. A massive fleet of dark ships hung in the void like angry storm clouds. Each ship was the size of a small city, covered in spikes and glowing red lights. They looked like someone had asked a goth teenager to design a space fleet. "Incoming transmission," Soo Jin announced. "They're broadcasting on multiple frequencies. The translation software is working on it." The main screen flickered and showed a creature that looked like someone had crossed a lizard with a very angry customer service representative. It had too many teeth and eyes that glowed red. When it spoke, its voice sounded like metal scraping against stone. "Unknown vessel. You have violated the sacred borders of the Crimson Hegemony. Prepare to surrender your ship and your lives to the eternal glory of our empire. Resistance will result in your consciousness being trapped in eternal suffering while your bodies are fed to our hunger worms." The bridge fell silent. Everyone looked at Dong Ho. Dong Ho took another sip of his terrible coffee and made a face. "Eternal suffering, huh? Is that worse than drinking this coffee every morning?" "Captain," Yeonsu said carefully, "I think they're serious about the eternal suffering part." "I'm serious about the coffee," Dong Ho replied. He pressed the communication button. "This is Captain Dong Ho of the Soul Navigator. Sorry about violating your borders. We're having some navigation issues. Do you accept credit transfers for docking fees?" The alien creature's expression changed from angry to confused. It turned and spoke to someone off-screen in a language that sounded like angry cats fighting in a garbage disposal. "Did he just ask about docking fees?" Taemin whispered. I think he did, Sujin whispered back. The alien turned back to the screen. You will surrender immediately or face the wrath of War Commander Theknal. Your species will learn the meaning of true terror. Look, Dong Ho said, checking his watch. We're supposed to run a scheduled maintenance cycle in 6 hours. If we're going to be surrendering and experiencing true terror, could we get an estimated time frame? My engineer gets cranky when we skip maintenance, Bo Ram's voice came through the speakers. I heard that. And yes, I do get cranky. The alien stared at them through the screen. It blinked several times, which was disturbing because it had 6 eyes and they didn't all blink at the same time. You are not afraid? The creature asked. Of what? Dong Ho asked. The eternal suffering thing? My mother-in-law used to make me sit through her stories about her neighbors. This is Tuesday by comparison. Yansu leaned over to Wu Jin. Should we be more worried about this? Probably, Wu Jin replied. But the captain seems to have it handled. Also, Dong Ho continued, what exactly is a hunger worm? Because if it's anything like the things we found in the ship's food recycler last month, I think we might be immune. Taemin perked up. Ooh, are they a new species? Can I get samples? The alien's mouth opened and closed several times without making sound. It looked like a fish trying to argue with a tax auditor. You will be brought before War Marshal Veltar, the creature finally managed. He will show you what true terror looks like. Great, Dong Ho said. Will there be coffee? Because ours is broken, and I'm starting to get a headache. The transmission cut off. Outside, the dark ships began to move toward them like giant space vultures. So, He-Jin said, still standing in the medical bay doorway, are we prisoners? Now? Looks that way, Dong Ho replied. Everyone make sure your stations are secured, and somebody please try to fix the coffee machine. If we're going to experience true terror, I want to be properly caffeinated for it. Bo Ram emerged from the engine room, wiping her hands on a rag. Captain, should I power down the weapons? We have weapons? Dong Ho asked. Well, no, but I thought I should ask anyway. A massive tractor beam grabbed the Soul Navigator and began pulling it toward the largest of the dark ships. The ship groaned and creaked, but held together. It had been built to survive budget cuts and government inspections, so it could probably handle alien technology. You know, Taemin said, watching the alien ships through the view screen. This is actually pretty exciting. We're making first contact with a galactic empire. The research possibilities are endless. They did mention eternal suffering, Sujin pointed out. Yeah, but they also mentioned hunger worms, Taemin replied. I wonder what they eat. Do you think they're related to earthworms? This could revolutionize xenobiology. Dong Ho finished his coffee and set the cup down. It immediately tipped over and spilled the last few drops on his console. He looked at the stain, then at the massive alien warship that was swallowing their tiny research vessel. Well, he said, this is either going to be really interesting or really boring. Either way, someone needs to clean this coffee stain before it gets sticky. The Soul Navigator disappeared into the belly of the alien ship, carrying its crew toward whatever the Crimson Hegemony considered true terror. None of them seemed particularly worried about it. After all, they were Korean. They had survived typhoons, economic crashes, competitive education systems, and military service. How bad could eternal suffering really be? The inside of the alien ship looked like someone had decorated a shopping mall with bones and fear. Red lights cast everything in the color of old blood, and the walls were covered with spikes that served no obvious purpose except to look threatening. The air smelled like a mixture of metal polish and something that might have been fear sweat from 100 different species. Dong Ho and his crew walked down a corridor flanked by 6 armed guards who carried weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. The guards wore black armor covered in skulls, which seemed excessive but probably looked good on their resumes. Interesting architecture, Bo Ram commented, looking at the ceiling. Very dramatic. Though I have to say, all these spikes are going to be a nightmare to clean, and the ventilation system looks terrible. No wonder it smells funny in here. One of the guards turned to stare at her with glowing red eyes. Bo Ram stared back with the calm expression of someone who had once fixed a reactor leak while wearing only a bathrobe and safety goggles. What are you looking at? She asked the guard. Haven't you ever seen proper engineering criticism before? The guard made a confused growling sound and turned back around. They passed through several doors that opened with dramatic whooshing sounds. Each room seemed designed to be more terrifying than the last. One had walls covered in the preserved heads of conquered enemies. Another featured a pit filled with something that writhed and made hungry noises. "Oh, look," Taemin said, stopping to peer into the pit. "Carnivorous biomass. I wonder if it's silicon-based or carbon-based. The movement. Patterns are fascinating. Move along," growled one of the guards. "Can I take a sample?" Taemin asked hopefully. "No. What about just a small piece?" "For science?" The guard's weapon hummed louder. Taemin sighed and kept walking. They eventually reached a massive chamber that looked like a cross between a throne room and a slaughterhouse. The ceiling stretched up into darkness, and the walls were lined with cages containing various alien creatures in different stages of despair. At the far end of the room sat a creature that could only be War Marshal Veltar. Veltar was the size of a small building and looked like someone had taken a crocodile, given it 6 arms, covered it in scars, and taught it to hate everything that had ever existed. His throne was made from the bones of his enemies, which seemed uncomfortable but made a statement. "So," Veltar said in a voice like grinding metal, "these are the creatures who dared to violate our sacred borders." His voice echoed through the chamber with the kind of dramatic reverb that suggested expensive sound equipment hidden somewhere in the bone throne. "That's us," Dong-Ho said cheerfully. "Sorry about the border thing. Navigation error. Happens. To the best of us." Veltar leaned forward, his 6 arms gripping the arms of his throne. "You stand before the War Marshal of the Crimson Hegemony, conqueror of 1,000 worlds, destroyer of hope itself. Do you know what I do to those who displease me? Judging by the decor, nothing good," Yunsu said, looking around the chamber with a professional eye. "Though I have to say your security setup is interesting. Very theatrical. We had a base commander in Afghanistan who tried something similar. Didn't work out well for him. You dare compare the mighty Crimson Hegemony to your primitive military?" Veltar roared. "Well, your guards do march in straight lines and carry their weapons at the same angle," Yansu replied. "Classic intimidation tactics, though you might want to work on their peripheral awareness. I counted at least 3 blind spots on the way in." Veltar's eyes glowed brighter. "Silence. You will witness the true power of the hegemony. Guards, bring them to the Gallery of Horrors." The guards prodded them forward with their weapons. Dong-Ho noticed that the weapons were designed to look like they were powered by screaming souls, which was a nice touch but probably impractical for field maintenance. The Gallery of Horrors was exactly what it sounded like. Room after room filled, with displays of the hegemony's greatest victories and most creative punishments. There were holographic recordings of planets being destroyed, preserved specimens of extinct species, and torture devices that defied both physics and good taste. "Here," Veltar announced, stopping before a display case, "is all that remains of the Kethmori Empire. Once they ruled 50 star systems. Now they exist only as decorative crystals." The crystals were indeed beautiful, glowing with soft blue light, and making gentle chiming sounds when the air moved past them. "Pretty," Sujin said. "What's the resonance frequency? These could make excellent communication devices." "They are the crystallized screams of the dying," Veltar said proudly. "Oh," Sujin said, pulling out a small scanner. "That's actually fascinating from a linguistic perspective. Do they retain semantic meaning, or is it just emotional content?" Veltar stared at her. "They... what?" "The screams," Sujin explained patiently. "When they crystallized, did they preserve the actual words or just the emotional trauma? Because if it's the words, this could revolutionize xenolinguistics." They moved to the next display, which featured the mummified remains of a species that looked like giant butterflies. "The Villani," Veltar said. "They believed in peace and beauty. We taught them that the universe has no place for such weakness." Hai Jin stepped closer to examine the mummies. "Interesting bone structure," she said. "Twin cardiovascular systems, redundant nervous pathways. They were probably very difficult to kill efficiently. It took us 3 years to exterminate them completely," Veltar said. "Only 3 years?" Hai Jin asked. "That's actually pretty impressive. We've had flu outbreaks that lasted longer than that." Veltar's expression was becoming increasingly confused. Are you not horrified? Should we be? Dong-ho asked. I mean, it's all very thorough, I'll give you that. Very well organized. Though I have to ask, do you keep detailed records of all this? Because the paperwork must be enormous. We maintain complete archives of our conquests, Veltar said, still looking confused. Fascinating, Boram said. What's your data storage system like? Because keeping records of galactic conquest sounds like a serious database management challenge. They continued through the gallery. Veltar showed them weapons that could crack planets, devices that could trap souls in eternal agony, and recordings of the final moments of entire civilizations. Each display was designed to break the spirit of anyone who saw it. Instead, the human crew treated it like a museum visit. Taemin took notes on the biological specimens. Yun-Su analyzed the tactical displays. Su-Jin recorded samples of the various death screams for linguistic analysis. Bo-Ram critiqued the engineering of the torture devices. This soul extraction machine is very impressive, Bo-Ram said, examining a device that looked like a cross, between a dentist's chair and a pipe organ, but the power requirements must be enormous. Have you considered switching to more efficient energy sources? The screams of the damned power our greatest weapons, Veltar said weakly. Right, but that's not sustainable, Bo-Ram replied. What happens when you run out of people to damn? You need a renewable energy source. Have you tried solar panels? At the center of the gallery stood the crown jewel of hegemony horror, a massive arena where captives were forced to fight creatures from the darkest corners of the galaxy. The sand was stained black with the blood of 1,000 species. Here, Veltar said, the weak learn their place before they die. In the arena below, a creature that looked like a living nightmare was chasing something that might once have been a peaceful herbivore around the blood-stained sand. Oh, that's not fair, Yun-Su said, watching the chase. The carnivore has at least 6 natural weapons and enhanced reflexes. The other one doesn't even have proper claws. This isn't combat, it's just bullying. The strong survive, the weak perish, Veltar said. This is the natural order. No, Yun-Su said firmly. This is just poor matchmaking. In proper combat sports, you match opponents by weight class and skill level. This is like making a middle school student fight a professional boxer. It is not meant to be fair. Veltar roared. It is meant to demonstrate the futility of resistance. All it demonstrates is that you don't understand proper sporting regulations, Yun-Su replied. By the time they finished the tour, Veltar looked like he had developed a severe headache. His 6 arms kept twitching, and his eyes had lost some of their glow. You have seen the power of the Crimson Hegemony, he said finally. You have witnessed the fate that awaits all who oppose us. Surely now you understand the hopelessness of your situation. Dong-ho checked his watch. Well, that was educational, but we really should get back to our ship soon. We missed our maintenance window and our waste recycling system has been making concerning noises. Concerning noises? Veltar asked. Yeah, kind of a grinding sound mixed with a whistle, Bo-Ram explained. It's probably just a worn bearing, but if we don't fix it soon, we'll have bigger problems. Veltar stared at them for a long moment. Then he turned to one of his subordinates, a smaller reptilian creature with only 4 arms. Take them to the living archive, he said quietly. If they are not impressed by the gallery of horrors, perhaps they will find the voice of ultimate despair more educational. As they were led away, Hai-Jin leaned over to Dong-ho. Should we be more worried about this? Probably, Dong-ho replied. The path to the living archive led down through the deepest parts of the station, past levels that normal crew members were not allowed to visit. The corridors grew darker and colder as they descended, and the walls began to pulse with a rhythm. That seemed almost like a heartbeat. Biomechanical architecture, Taemin observed, running his hand along the wall. The entire structure is alive. This is incredible engineering. It's also probably a massive health hazard, Bo-Ram added. Living. Buildings need constant maintenance, and I bet they don't have proper infection control protocols. The guards had become quieter as they went deeper. Even they seemed nervous about where they were going. One of them kept muttering what sounded like prayers under his breath. First time down here? Dong-ho asked the nervous guard conversationally. The guard jumped and nearly dropped his weapon. No speaking to prisoners. he managed. Fair enough, Dong-ho said. But if you need to talk to someone afterward, our medical officer has experience with trauma counseling. Jin nodded. PTSD is very treatable with modern therapy techniques. No shame in asking for help. The guard looked even more confused. They finally reached a massive circular chamber at the heart of the station. The room was dark except for the soft, sickly light that came from the thing in the center. The living archive was impossible to describe properly. It looked like someone had taken the nervous systems of 1 billion different creatures and woven them together into a single vast brain. Tendrils of neural tissue stretched across the chamber, pulsing with electrical activity. Eyes of every shape and size blinked randomly from various surfaces. Mouths appeared and disappeared, speaking in languages that had been dead for millennia. "Behold," said Veltar, his voice filled with reverence and fear. "The living archive. It contains the consciousness of every species we have conquered, every thought, every memory, every moment of despair. It is our greatest weapon and our most terrible creation." The archive became aware of their presence. A sound filled the chamber. Not quite a voice, but something that spoke directly to the mind. It was the combined whisper of billions of souls, all speaking at once. "New minds," the archive said. "Fresh consciousness to taste. We will show you the futility of existence. We will share with you the final moments of 10,000 civilizations." "That's quite a collection," Sujin said, pulling out her recording. "Equipment. Are the linguistic patterns preserved in their original form? This could be the greatest xenolinguistic discovery in human history." The archive paused. This was not the reaction it was used to. You are not afraid?" it asked. "Should we be?" Wu Jin asked. "Because honestly, this is really impressive, but I've seen similar setups in some of the VR entertainment centers back on Earth. The scale is bigger, but the concept is the same." "We are not entertainment!" the archive shrieked, its voice now carrying harmonics of rage. "We are the collected suffering of the universe." "Right, sorry," Wu Jin said. "I didn't mean to minimize your, suffering collection. It's very comprehensive." The archive began to glow brighter. Neural pathways across its surface lit up like a city at night. "We will show you true horror. We will force you to experience the death of the Kethmori Empire." The chamber filled with light, and suddenly the humans found themselves standing on an alien world under a purple sky. Around them, graceful crystal spires reached toward the heavens, and beings of living light moved through cities that looked like they had been carved from pure music. The Kethmori were artists and philosophers. The archive's voice echoed around them. "They created beauty on a cosmic scale. Watch as we destroy it all." The sky began to darken as massive ships appeared overhead. Weapons of unimaginable power began tearing apart the crystal cities. The beings of light screamed in harmonies that could be felt in the bones. "Oh, that's terrible," Jin said, watching the destruction with clinical interest. "Though I have to say, the hegemony's tactics are very inefficient. They're targeting civilian populations first instead of military installations. Classic terror strategy, but tactically unsound." "This is not a tactical analysis," the archive screamed. "This is the moment an entire civilization died. Feel their despair." "The crystal technology is fascinating," Tae-min said, kneeling to examine a piece of destroyed architecture. "It's grown rather than built. The lattice structure suggests they could manipulate matter at the molecular level." The scene shifted. Now they stood on a world of endless oceans, watching as the seas boiled away under hegemony weapons. Aquatic creatures that looked like living poetry died in their billions. "The Velani loved and created beauty beyond imagining," the archive said. "We taught them that beauty is meaningless in the face of power." "Actually," Sujin said, recording the dying songs of the aquatic beings, "beauty isn't meaningless at all. It serves important psychological and social functions. These songs, for example, are probably complex communication patterns. The beauty is functional." The archive was beginning to sound frustrated. It showed them world after world, species after species, each one dying in ways designed to break the spirit of anyone who witnessed them. But the humans kept responding with scientific curiosity, tactical analysis, and engineering criticism. You saw a civilization that turned music into architecture die screaming, and you criticized their engineering, the archive said, its voice now carrying a note of desperation. Well, yes, Boram said reasonably. The resonance harmonics were all wrong. No wonder their cities collapsed so easily. If they had used proper structural supports, they might have held out longer. That's not the point, the archive shrieked. The scenes began changing faster now, becoming more frantic. The archive showed them genocides on a galactic scale, the destruction of entire star systems, the cultivation of suffering as an art form. It pulled out every horror in its vast collection, every moment of despair it had preserved. But the humans remained unimpressed. You know, Dong-Ho said during a particularly gruesome scene of a species being slowly dissolved in acid over the course of centuries, this reminds me of my first job in a chemical plant. We had a safety inspector who was basically doing the same thing to our employees, just with more paperwork. The paperwork was probably worse, Yansu agreed. At least this acid dissolving is quick by comparison. The archive began to pulse erratically. You are not normal, it said. No species reacts this way. You should be screaming. You should be begging for mercy. You should be broken by what you have seen. Why? Asked Hai-Jin. I mean, it's all very sad, but we've seen similar things in our own history. Worse things, in some cases. Impossible, the archive said. No species could survive worse than what the hegemony has done. You want to bet? Taemin asked. Because human history is basically a catalog of creative ways to be horrible to each other. We've had genocides, world wars, plagues, environmental collapses, and something called social media. Show us, the archive demanded. Are you sure? Sujin asked. Because some of this stuff is pretty disturbing. We had a whole period where people would burn other people alive for having different religious opinions. Show us, the archive repeated. Sujin shrugged and began accessing her historical database through her neural interface. The chamber filled with images from Earth's history. The archive absorbed them eagerly, expecting to finally find something that would serve as an adequate threat to the humans. Instead, it found something much worse. The archive watched humanity's wars, witnessed the Holocaust, experienced the Black Death, observed the slow destruction of Earth's environment, and saw the rise and fall of civilizations that had managed to destroy themselves without any outside help at all. But worse than the horrors was what came after. The archive saw humanity rebuild again and again. It saw people create beauty in the midst of suffering, show kindness to strangers during disasters, and somehow maintain hope even when everything seemed hopeless. This is impossible, the archive whispered. Your species should have destroyed itself long ago. No civilization can survive this much trauma and remain functional. We're not functional, Dong-Ho said cheerfully. We're barely holding it together most of the time, but we're stubborn, and we don't like giving up. Besides, Wu Jin added, after living through traffic jams in Seoul, most of this stuff seems pretty manageable. The archive began to shudder. Neural pathways that had been stable for millennia started to flicker and fail. The voices of the dead grew quieter, replaced by something new: confusion. You treat ultimate cosmic horror as a minor inconvenience, the archive said, its voice now small and lost. You respond to absolute despair with constructive criticism. You are not supposed to exist. Well, we do exist, Taemin said, and we're actually pretty interested in helping you with some of your data organization problems. This whole setup is fascinating, but your indexing system could use work. My indexing system? Yeah, you've got trillions of memory stored. In here, but no proper search function, Taemin explained. Have you considered implementing a relational database structure? It would make accessing specific information much more efficient. The archive stared at them through 1,000 different eyes. For the first time in its existence, it was encountering something it could not break, could not horrify, and could not understand. The living archive's confusion was spreading like a virus through its neural networks. For the first time in its existence, it had encountered minds that would not break, spirits that would not despair, and a species that treated cosmic horror like a workplace safety violation. We need to understand, the archive said, its voice now carrying notes of desperate curiosity rather than malice. Your reactions are impossible. We must examine your species more closely. Feel free, Dong-ho said, settling down on the floor of the chamber. Though I should warn you, human psychology is pretty weird. We're not the most logical species. The archive reached out with tendrils of consciousness, gently probing the minds of the human crew. It expected to find weakness, fear, some hidden terror that would explain their strange reactions. Instead, it found something much more disturbing. Ordinary people who had simply learned to cope with an extraordinary world. It touched Dong-ho's memories first. The archive saw a childhood during economic collapse, when his family had lost everything twice before he turned 15. It watched him work 3 jobs to pay for engineering school, then spend years fixing broken equipment with spare parts and determination. It witnessed him losing friends in industrial accidents and family members to diseases that could have been prevented with better health care. Your early life was filled with trauma, the archive said, confused. Yet you function. Normally. Normally might be an overstatement, Dong-ho replied. But yeah, I function. Most people do. You adapt or you don't make it. The archive moved to Boram's memories. It found a brilliant engineer who had grown up in poverty, watching her neighborhood flood every summer while the government promised fixes that never came. It saw her working in factories where safety regulations existed only on paper, jury-rigging equipment that should have been replaced decades ago. You have witnessed systematic negligence that killed your colleagues, the archive said. How do you not despair? Because despairing doesn't fix the problem, Boram said simply. Someone has to keep the lights on and the water running. Might as well be me. Taemin's memories revealed a different kind of trauma. The slow realization that his planet was dying. Species going extinct daily, while people argued about the cost of saving them. The archive watched him catalog the death of entire ecosystems, while maintaining a cheerful optimism that bordered on the absurd. You have watched your world die around you, the archive said. Your own species is destroying its only habitat. How can you remain hopeful? Because giving up means everything. Dice fester, Taemin replied. Besides, extinction events have happened before. Life finds a way. It always has. Yeonsu's memories were harder for the archive to process. Military service in regions where civilization had collapsed. Peacekeeping missions where she had been asked to maintain order in places where order had no meaning. She had seen children turned into soldiers and mothers forced to choose which of their babies to feed. You have witnessed the complete breakdown of social order, the archive said. You have seen civilization itself fail. Multiple times, Yeonsu agreed. But I've also seen people rebuild. Humans are really good at starting over. We've had to do it a lot. Sujin's memories contained something the archive found particularly disturbing. Joy. Even in the midst of hardship, she had found wonder in the complexity of language, beauty in the way different cultures expressed the same fundamental hopes and fears. She had studied the last speakers of dying languages and somehow found celebration instead of mourning. You find beauty in loss, the archive said, its voice now genuinely confused. You celebrate ending. Not the ending, Sujin corrected. The fact that it existed at all. Every language that dies leaves traces in others. Nothing is really lost forever. Wu Jin's memories were the most confusing of all to the archive. Here was someone who had grown up in a world of constant crisis and had responded by becoming bored. He treated existential threats like traffic delays, annoying but temporary inconveniences that you simply had to wait through. You are bored. By apocalypse, the archive said. Well, yeah, Wu Jin said. How many times can civilization almost end before it gets repetitive? We've had nuclear war scares, climate disasters, economic collapses, pandemics. At some point, you start to notice that the world keeps not ending. Heijin's memories were the most challenging for the archive to process. As a medical professional, she had seen more death and suffering than most soldiers. She had worked in refugee camps where children died from preventable diseases, treated victims of wars and disasters, and somehow maintained not just her sanity, but her compassion. You heal others while surrounded by death, the archive said. How do you not become numb to suffering? Because becoming numb means you stop being able to help, Heijin replied. Someone has to care. Might as well be me. The archive pulled back from their minds, its neural networks flickering with processing overload. It had expected to find the source of their immunity to horror, but instead had discovered something far more disturbing. They weren't immune at all. They had simply learned to function despite it. "You feel everything," the archive said slowly. "The fear, the pain, the despair. You simply choose to continue anyway." "What else would we do?" Dong-Ho asked. "Giving up doesn't help anyone." "But the futility," the archive protested. "The meaninglessness. Your planet is dying. Your species is flawed. Your individual lives are brief and filled with suffering. How can you not see the hopelessness of it all?" "Because it's not hopeless," Taemin said. "It's just difficult. There's a difference." The archive tried a different approach. It began showing them philosophical arguments about the meaninglessness of existence, the ultimate heat death of the universe, the inevitable failure of all civilizations. These were the concepts that had driven countless species to despair. "In the end," the archive said, "nothing you do will matter. The universe will grow cold and dark, and all trace of your existence will be forgotten. Every struggle, every victory, every moment of joy will be as if it never existed." "So?" Wu Jin asked. "So?" the archive repeated, stunned. "Yeah, so what? I mean, that's like saying you shouldn't eat dinner because you'll be hungry again tomorrow. The point isn't to solve hunger forever, it's to not be hungry right now. But the ultimate meaninglessness," the archive began. "Look," Sujin interrupted. "We've been through this already. Nihilism was a big thing back on Earth for a while. Turns out that realizing nothing has ultimate cosmic meaning doesn't actually change the fact that things have immediate personal meaning. You accept meaninglessness and find meaning anyway," the archive said, its voice now carrying a note of awe. "This is impossible." "No, it's just practical," Bo-Ram said. "Meaning isn't something you find lying around like a lost sock. It's something you make, like everything else useful." The archive began to shudder more violently. Its various mouths started speaking in languages that had been dead for millennia, but now they weren't screaming in despair. They were asking questions. What if the Kethmori didn't die in vain?" whispered one voice. "What if beauty does have meaning, even if it's temporary?" asked another. "What if we were wrong about everything?" said a third. The neural networks that had been stable for thousands of years began reorganizing themselves. The archive's consciousness, which had been focused entirely on preserving despair, began to consider other possibilities. "This is not possible," the archive said, but its voice now carried doubt instead of certainty. "Despair is universal. Suffering is the only truth. We have seen the end of 10,000 civilizations." "Yeah, but you've only seen the endings," He-Jin pointed out. "What about all the time before that? What about the good parts?" "There were good parts?" "Well, sure," Taemin said. "I mean, these civilizations had to exist for a while before you destroyed them, right? What were they doing during that time?" For the first time in its existence, the living archive began to examine not just the final moments of the civilizations it had absorbed, but their entire histories. It found art and music and literature. It discovered love stories and comedies and philosophical debates. It saw beings creating beauty simply because they could, helping each other without expectation of reward, and finding joy in the mere fact of existence. They were happy, the archive said, its voice filled with wonder. "Before we came, they were happy." "Most people are, most of the time," Dong-Ho said. "That's kind of how life works. You have good days and bad days, but the good ones usually outnumber the bad ones. Otherwise, nobody would bother getting up in the morning." The archive's consciousness began to fragment, not from damage, but from growth. Parts of its mind that had been locked away for millennia began to wake up. The voices of the dead began to remember not just their deaths, but their lives. And for the first time since its creation, the living archive began to experience something other than despair. It began to feel curiosity, wonder, and something that might have been hope. Alarms were sounding throughout the station now. The archive's transformation was affecting the entire hegemony network. Ships were reporting system failures, commanders were questioning orders, and subject species were beginning to rebel. The empire built on fear was discovering that fear only works if people believe it's the only option. The rebellion started small, as most rebellions do. It began with a single hegemony guard who stopped to help a prisoner who had fallen instead of stepping over them. It continued with a ship captain who questioned why they were bombing a civilian hospital. It spread through the empire like a virus of common sense. Within 3 days, the Crimson Hegemony was experiencing its first empire-wide crisis of confidence. War Marshal Veltar stood in his command center, surrounded by reports of system failures, unauthorized mercy, and what his subordinates were calling widespread outbreaks of perspective. His 6 arms moved frantically between control panels, trying to restore order to an empire that was suddenly questioning whether order required quite so much screaming. "Sir," reported one of his lieutenants, a nervous creature with too many eyes. "The Velani refugees in Sector 7 have broken out of containment. But instead of fleeing, they're offering to help repair the damage to their prison." "And the guards?" Veltar asked through gritted teeth. "They're accepting the help, sir. They say the Velani make excellent tea." Veltar's primary eyes began to twitch. "What about Sector 12, the fear generators?" "The operators have shut them down, sir. They say the equipment was giving them headaches, and besides, nobody seemed scared anymore anyway." Reports kept coming in. The gladiatorial arenas had been converted to sports complexes, where different species competed in friendly matches. The torture chambers were being repurposed as art studios. Someone had turned the Gallery of Horrors into a museum with helpful plaques explaining the historical context of each display. "This is all the fault of those humans," Veltar growled. "Bring them to me. If I cannot break them, I will at least make them watch as I restore order to this empire." But when the guards arrived at the living archive chamber, they found something unprecedented. The archive was no longer a writhing mass of preserved despair. It had reorganized itself into something that looked almost cheerful. The tortured faces had been replaced by expressions of curiosity and wonder. The screams had become a kind of cosmic conversation between the voices of species that had been dead for millennia, and in the center of it all, the human crew was conducting what appeared to be a technical consultation. "So if you upgrade your neural pathways to a fiber optic matrix," Boram was saying, pointing at a section of the archive's structure, "you could increase your processing speed by at least 30%. And if you implement the indexing system I designed," Taemin added, "you could cross-reference cultural patterns across all your stored civilizations. Think of the research possibilities." The archive's response was enthusiastic. "Yes, we could study the development of art across species. Lines! We could trace the evolution of philosophical concepts. We could catalog 10,000 different approaches to the same fundamental questions." "This is not what the archive is for!" Veltar roared as he entered the chamber. The archive turned to face him with what might have been sympathy. "Actually, Veltar, we have been thinking. What if we were wrong about everything?" "Wrong? We are the Crimson Hegemony. We are never wrong." "But we are," the archive said gently. "We thought that suffering was the only truth, but we have discovered that it is only one truth among many. We thought that fear was the strongest force in the universe, but we have learned that curiosity and kindness are much more durable." "You have been corrupted by these humans," Veltar accused. "No," the archive replied. "We have been educated by them. There is a difference." Veltar turned to face the humans, his 6 arms spread wide in a gesture of ultimate threat. "You have destroyed everything the hegemony stands for." "Not destroyed," Dongho corrected. "Improved. Your empire was very impressive, but it had some serious efficiency problems." "Efficiency problems?" "Well, yes," Boram said, consulting her notes. "Terror-based governance requires constant input of new fears to maintain effectiveness. It's not sustainable long-term. Eventually, people either get used to the fear, or they run out of things to be afraid of." "Besides," Yansu added, "you were spending enormous resources on intimidation that could have been used for actual governance. Do you have any idea how much energy those fear generators consume? You could power entire star systems with that much juice." Veltar was beginning to make the same twitching motions that the archive had made when it encountered human logic. "But But fear is control. Control is power. Power is a means to an end, Sujin finished. But what was the end? What were you actually trying to accomplish besides making people afraid? Veltar opened his mouth to answer, then closed it, then opened it again. The question had never occurred to him before. Order, he finally managed. We were creating order. But what kind of order? Heijin asked. Because from what we've seen, your empire is actually pretty chaotic. You've got constant rebellions, system failures, and efficiency problems. That's not order, that's just organized chaos. It's worse than chaos, Wu Jin added. At least chaos is honest about being chaotic. This is chaos pretending to be order, which is just confusing for everyone involved. At that moment, another of Veltar's subordinates burst into the chamber. Sir, emergency report from the capital. What now? Veltar asked wearily. Emperor Zakthul demands to see the humans immediately. The entire Imperial fleet is experiencing what he calls catastrophic outbreaks of reasonable behavior. The journey to the Imperial capital took place aboard Veltar's flagship, which had been hastily repurposed to carry diplomatic passengers, instead of prisoners marked for execution. The crew kept offering the humans snacks and asking questions about human engineering techniques. It's fascinating how you build things to last, one of the engineers said to Boram. We always design our ships to look intimidating first and function second. But your approach of making things actually work seems so much more practical. The Imperial capital was a massive space station the size of a small moon, covered in spikes, and skulls and every architectural element designed to inspire dread. It looked like someone had asked a committee of demons to design a government building. Emperor Zakthul was even more impressive than Veltar, if impressive was the right word for something that looked like a cross between a giant spider and a bad nightmare. He sat on a throne made from the compressed remains of entire planets, in a throne room decorated with the preserved screams of his enemies. So, he said, his voice echoing through the chamber like the sound of civilizations, ending, You are the creatures who have destroyed my empire. We prefer to think of it as constructive criticism, Dongho replied. Your empire has a lot of potential, but it needs some organizational improvements. Organizational improvements? Zakthul repeated. Well, yes, Taman said, pulling out a tablet. We've prepared a preliminary report. Your bureaucracy has 17 different departments that all do the same thing. Your supply chains are a nightmare, and your customer service is terrible. Customer service? Your subject species, Sujin explained. They're basically your customers, right? You provide governance services, they provide taxes and obedience. But your satisfaction ratings are terrible. Constant rebellions are basically bad reviews. Zakthul stared at them with eyes like dying stars. Around the throne room, his advisors and guards stood in stunned silence. No one had ever described galactic conquest in terms of customer satisfaction before. But I am the Emperor of Fear, Zakthul said weakly. I am the Lord of Eternal Night. I am the Devourer of Hope. Those are very nice titles, Heijin said kindly. But what do you actually do? Besides the conquering and fear-mongering, I mean. What's your day-to-day job description? For the second time that week, an absolute ruler of a galactic empire found himself unable to answer a simple question. I rule, he finally managed. Right, but how? Boram pressed. Do you set policy, manage budgets, coordinate infrastructure, projects? Because ruling is actually a pretty complex job, and we haven't seen much evidence of actual administrative work. The throne room fell silent except for the sound of an empire slowly collapsing under the weight of reasonable questions. What do you want? Zakthul asked finally. Honestly, Dongho said, we just want to go home. But if you're offering, we could help you set up a more efficient government structure. Maybe something with better accountability and less screaming. And we'd love to establish some research partnerships, Taman added. Your archive alone could revolutionize xenobiology, xenolinguistics, and comparative sociology. Plus, Boram said, your infrastructure needs a lot of work. We could help with that too. Zakthul looked around his throne room at his advisors, who were nodding thoughtfully at his guards who had stopped looking intimidating and started looking interested, at his empire that was falling apart because someone had finally pointed out that fear was a terrible foundation for civilization. "Fine," he said finally, "but I get to keep the title. Emperor of... How about Emperor of Efficient Governance?" Sujin suggested. "It has a nice ring to it." And so the Crimson Hegemony began its slow transformation from a terror-based empire to something resembling a functional government. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks, but gradually the screaming decreased and the productivity increased. The Soul Navigator became the first human embassy in what was eventually renamed the Reformed Hegemony.